The dungeon master opened the corridor door and stopped. Every lock was broken. Not picked, not force broken. The iron split at its molecular structure, the way iron split when something had passed through it that iron was not designed to withstand. The chains were on the floor. The cell doors stood open, and the prisoners, 17 of them, varying degrees of frightened and filthy and confused, were not running. They were standing in a loose circle around the corridor's center, where a woman lay unconscious on the stone, her breathing shallow and her voice entirely gone. She had not meant to do any of it. The dungeon master knew this the way you knew certain things without evidence. From the specific quality of the scene, the prisoner's stillness, the broken iron, the woman's face with its expression not of triumph, but of absolute depletion. Something had spoken here that she had not sent. He sent for the king. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Sable had been managing her voice since she was 6 years old. Not consciously at six, she had simply been a child who sang to herself while doing chores. And the songs had a specific quality that made the neighbors stop what they were doing and stand at their windows with the expressions of people being reminded of something important they had forgotten. This was not alarming in itself. What was alarming was when she had sung, at 7, during a dispute between two neighboring families that had been building toward violence for 3 weeks. And the two men at the center of it had simply stopped mid-argument and stood in the street looking at each other with the specific quality of people who had just found the water level of their anger. And it had turned out to be considerably lower than the argument had suggested. Her mother had put her hands on Sable's shoulders and said, very quietly, "Less of that." The management had become a practice, and the practice had become a discipline, and the discipline had become, by the time she reached adulthood, the specific daily calibration of an instrument that required constant attention to keep below the threshold where it became consequential. She kept her voice soft in crowds. She did not sing in public spaces. She modulated even ordinary conversation to stay below the register, where the gift's intermediate level activated the frequency that interfered with alpha command signals, that produced the specific dissonance she had felt in her own body since adolescence when authority tried to compel her in ways she did not agree with. She had come to the palace because the outer settlements needed someone to come. The 3 settlements in the kingdom's northern territory, small communities, mixed pack and omega populations, subsistence agricultural, were facing a water rights decision that would redirect the primary river channel for the benefit of the eastern noble territories. The decision had been presented to the King's Council as a technical adjustment. What it was, in practical terms, was the elimination of the water source that approximately 4,000 people depended on for their crops, their animals, and their drinking water. She had not been selected to come. No one had selected her. She had simply been the person in the settlements who understood both the technical details of the water rights situation and the political structure of the palace well enough to navigate the specific bureaucratic requirements of a formal court petition. She had filed the petition through correct channels. She had waited the required waiting period. She had attended the court session to which petitioners were admitted and had sat in the gallery and listened to the council's presentation of the water rights decision. The council's presentation omitted the settlements. Not accidentally, she could see, from the technical documentation she had spent 3 months reading, that the settlement's water dependency was present in the underlying data and had been removed from the summary that reached the king. The king was being asked to ratify a decision on the basis of a picture of the situation that was missing 4,000 people. She had stood up. She had not planned to stand up. She had planned to submit a written response through the petition process. But the king's command frequency had begun its ratification sweep the specific biological signal that compelled compliance from everyone in the room, and something in her had responded to the compulsion the way it always responded to compulsion, with the particular involuntary resistance that the gift produced when authority attempted to override her judgment. She had said, "The settlements are not in the summary." Her voice at that level, the controlled, everyday level, had a quality of clarity that made people attend. The room had turned. The king had turned. She had said what she knew, in the specific plain language of someone who had been reading technical documents for 3 months and understood the situation precisely. The king's command frequency had reached her and found no purchase. She had kept speaking. He had ordered her removed. She had kept speaking until the guards reached her, at which point she had said, in the specific quiet register that was the most controlled version of the gift she had, "I have filed a petition through correct channels which documents everything I have described. I would ask that it be read before any decision is ratified." The guards had escorted her to the dungeon. She had sat in the cell with the specific composure of someone who had expected this outcome at some probability and had chosen to proceed anyway. She had not sung. She had not spoken. She had managed the gift with the careful attention that 4 days without adequate food and 3 days without adequate water did not make easier. On the 4th day, she had lost consciousness. The gift had 3 registers, and she had named them herself because no one else had named them for her. The first was what she called the listening frequency, the everyday level of her voice that produced, in people who heard it, the specific quality of attention that she could not fully turn off. It was not compulsion. It was more like the resonance that a tuning fork produced in another tuning fork of the same pitch. Her voice activated a similar frequency in the people around her that made them more receptive, more present, more honest in their own self-assessment. She had no control over this level. It was simply what her voice did when she spoke. The second was the disruption frequency, the level that activated under sustained emotional pressure, or when she spoke truth that she could not contain. At this level, her voice interfered with alpha command frequencies in a way that she experienced as a specific internal vibration and others experienced as the sudden absence of compulsion. It did not override alpha command. It disrupted it, produced the specific dissonance that made the command frequency unreliable in her vicinity. The cost of extended use at this level was a specific headache that lasted hours, a rawness in her throat, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been bracing against a current and had finally pushed back. The third was the frequency she had no useful name for. She called it the deep register, and she had used it twice in her life before the dungeon, once at 9 years old when a fire had reached the locked granary and she had screamed and the lock had broken, and once at 16 when a man had her cornered in an alley and her scream had buckled the stone wall beside them and he had run. Both times she had been in extreme physical danger or distress. Both times she had been completely unaware of the register's activation until she saw its results. The cost was everything: complete vocal depletion, full physical collapse, several days of recovery during which she could produce no sound at all. The dungeon had activated the deep register on the 4th day of hunger and thirst. She had not screamed. She had simply been unconscious. and her body the deepest animal part of her that the gift lived in below the threshold of conscious management, had said the word it knew at the frequency that iron heard as a command. The word, she thought later, was probably free. She had woken in the corridor surrounded by 17 prisoners who were standing in a loose circle around her with the expressions of people who had been freed from something by something they did not understand, and who were not running because they seemed to understand intuitively that what had freed them was the unconscious woman on the floor, and that leaving felt wrong in the way that abandoning a sleeping child felt wrong. She had tried to speak. No sound came. She had tried again. Nothing. The deep register's cost was complete, and she was in its aftermath the specific absolute silence of a voice that had given everything it had. The dungeon master had arrived to find this scene. He had looked at the broken locks and the standing prisoners and the unconscious woman and had sent for the king with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that this was not a thing that could be managed at his level. She had been carried to the palace's medical wing. She had been unconscious for most of the first day and silent for all of the first 3 days. And on the third day she had been told she was to be brought before the king. She had sat up. She had accepted the water and the food that the medical staff had been providing and had not been able to thank them properly because she had no voice to thank them with. She had dressed in the clothing that was provided. She had walked to the audience chamber under guard, with the specific composure of someone who understood that composure was what the situation required and who had enough practice maintaining it under adverse conditions to do so even now. She had not been afraid. She examined the internal condition, precisely assessing. She was going before a man whose command frequency had not worked on her in court and who had responded to that experience by imprisoning her. She was going to him without the voice that was her primary tool and her primary threat. She was going to him as the person who had destroyed his dungeon without trying. These were the facts. She assembled them into a picture and looked at it. The picture did not tell her what was going to happen. It told her what she knew, which was enough. The dungeon was not the first time. She had understood this with the specific clarity of someone making a pattern recognition that had been forming for 20 years and had just, in the dungeon's broken iron aftermath, become entirely legible. Every institution she had moved through had done some version of the same thing, encountered the gift, experienced the specific discomfort of a frequency that did not respond to management, and attempted to contain what it could not manage. The school she had attended at 10 had placed her in a separate room for group lessons. Ostensibly because her voice was too loud in reality, she understood now. Because the teacher's authority relied on a mild command frequency that Sable's presence disrupted, and the disruption made maintaining classroom order more difficult, and the teacher more uncomfortable than any behavioral explanation could justify. The village assembly at 14 had asked her family not to bring her to public meetings after she had spoken at one, and the village elder had been unable to complete a procedural maneuver that required the specific command frequency compulsion that her voice in the room made unreliable. The elder had framed it as a behavioral concern. What it had been was the specific irritation of a man whose tool for managing public consensus had stopped working. The traveling merchants company she had joined at 19 to earn money for the journey to the capital had dismissed her after 3 weeks. The dismissal paperwork said performance concerns. What had happened was that the company's alpha manager had attempted to use command frequency to extract an agreement from a supplier that the supplier would not have agreed to without compulsion. And Sable in the adjacent room had made the command frequency unavailable, and the negotiation had concluded on genuinely mutual terms that were less favorable to the company than the compelled terms would have been. She had been dismissed from a company for making a negotiation honest. She had looked at the pattern of dismissals and separations and institutional exits and understood, sitting in the dungeon on the third day before the collapse, that the pattern had a specific shape. Every institution's relationship with her ended when the gift made the institution's power tools unreliable. Not when she did anything wrong, when she made wrong things impossible. The dungeon was the sharpest version of the pattern. He had imprisoned her for speaking truth that his command frequency could not compel her to stop speaking. He had put her in a cage to silence a voice that the cage could not contain. She had felt, sitting in the cell before the hunger overtook her ability to think clearly, the specific profound exhaustion of a lifetime of cages, not the physical exhaustion of the dungeon specifically, but the accumulated weight of 20 years of being contained, managed, separated from the spaces that found her threatening. She had also felt, beneath the exhaustion, the specific clarity that had always been present underneath. She was right. She had always been right. The gift that the institutions found threatening was the gift that made dishonest power unavailable in her vicinity. And dishonest power being unavailable was not a threat to people who were not using dishonest power. The dungeon's iron had not been able to hold her. Nothing had ever really held her. She had been managing herself to avoid the cost of being unmanageable. That management had cost her every institution she had tried to belong to. She was done with the management. She walked into the king's audience chamber with her voice entirely gone and her composure entirely present, and the deep register's aftermath in her body like the specific stillness after a storm. The audience chamber held 12 people. She counted them, because counting was the first thing she did in unfamiliar spaces, the number of people, their positions, the specific quality of the command frequency in the room, which she felt in the usual way she felt it, and which told her, immediately, something she had not expected: it was not working. Not because she was disrupting it, she had no voice, was producing no sound, was doing nothing that should have activated even the lowest level of the gift. It was not working because the king was not using it. King Raven was sitting at the head of the table, without the command frequency active. She had never encountered this before. Every alpha authority figure she had experienced in institutional contexts ran a passive background command frequency, not the active compulsion of direct command, but the specific low-level ambient signal that produced general deference and social compliance. It was unconscious in most cases, as automatic as breathing. Raven was not running it. Either he had turned it off deliberately, or proximity to her, even her silent proximity, was enough to make the passive frequency unreliable. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the specific quality of attention she had not expected from a man who had signed a dungeon order not threat assessment, not performed authority. The actual attention of a person encountering something genuinely outside their existing categories. He said, "Sit down." She sat. The guards positioned themselves at the room's edges. The council's senior members occupied the table's other seats. He said, "Can you speak?" She shook her head. Not a performance, the literal truth. She had tried 3 times in the medical wing and produced nothing. He said, "The Dungeon Master's report describes 17 cell doors, 43 individual lock mechanisms, and approximately 12 feet of the eastern wall's mortar joints, all of which failed simultaneously in the early morning of your 4th day of confinement. He said, "The medical staff's report describes your condition as consistent with extreme physical depletion." He said, "I am told you were unconscious when it happened." She nodded. He said, "So you did not intend it?" She shook her head. He said, "And you cannot stop it from happening again under similar conditions." She considered this carefully. She spread her hands on the table, palms up, the specific gesture of genuine uncertainty. She then picked up the pen that had been placed at her position and wrote on the paper beside it, "I can stop it if I am not physically compromised. The deep register activates when I am beyond a certain threshold of physical distress. I have never reached that threshold before because I have never been imprisoned without food and water for 4 days." He read it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What is the deep register?" She wrote for several minutes. She told him what she had told herself for 20 years, the 3 levels, their conditions, their costs. She wrote carefully and completely, with the archival precision of someone who had been documenting her own experience for 2 decades and had a very clear record. He read all of it. The council members were shifting in their chairs with the specific quality of people who wanted to speak, but were not speaking, which told her that the king had indicated he did not want them to. The silence was his management of the room, not the command frequency. The actual authority of a man who could choose to run a room without compulsion. He said, "What did you say in court?" She looked at him. She wrote, "You have my petition. Everything I said is in it. I filed it through correct channels 3 weeks before the session." He said, "I am aware." He said after a moment, in the voice of someone saying something they had been sitting with, "I had not read it before the session." She wrote for 40 minutes. Not the court summary, the full account. The 3 settlements, their water dependency. The technical documentation she had spent 3 months gathering. The specific section of the decision's underlying data that showed the settlement's dependency had been present and had been removed from the council summary. She wrote it the way she would have written it in court if she had been permitted to present it formally. Evidence first, analysis second, conclusion supported by specific citation. She pushed the document across the table. He read it. She watched him read. She had spent 20 years watching people receive information about the settlement's situation, the specific variation in their faces between the people who were encountering the information for the first time and the people who already knew it and were managing how it was being received. Raven's face had the specific quality of the first category, genuine encounter with information that was rearranging something. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the table for a moment with the particular quality of a man doing a private accounting that he was not going to narrate aloud. He said, "The decision has not been ratified." He said it quietly. He said, "It was on yesterday's council agenda, and I deferred it pending this conversation." She received this. She wrote, "I did not know that." He said, "You could not have known." He said, "You were in the medical wing." He looked at the document again. He said, "The settlement's water dependency was in the underlying data." She nodded. He said, "And it was not in the summary." She nodded. He said, "Who prepares the council summaries?" She wrote, "I don't know the palace's administrative structure. I know the data that was in the full documentation and the data that was in the summary. I can show you the specific omission if you have the summary document available." He looked at the council's senior administrative member, who was sitting at the table's far end with the specific quality of someone who had been hoping this conversation would go in a different direction. He said, "Bring the summary document." The administrator brought it. She and Raven spent the next hour working through the comparison, her written annotations against the original data, his questions, her answers in writing. The council members watched this process with the varied expressions of people at different stages of understanding what was happening. When they finished, the picture was clear. 3 specific data points about settlement water dependency had been present in the underlying documentation and absent from the council summary. The omission was not an error, the data was present in adjacent tables, and its absence from the summary required active removal rather than accidental oversight. He said to the administrator, "I want the complete information chain for this summary. Every person whose hands it went through." He said it in the voice that was not command frequency, but was the specific authority of a king who had just discovered something and was not going to let it be managed back out of his awareness. The administrator said, "Of course." Raven looked at Sable. He said, "You came to the palace for 4,000 people." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "You spoke in court because the petition process had produced a session where the petition's content was not present in the information the king received." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "And I imprisoned you for it." She wrote, "Yes." He said after a long silence, "I am going to need you to stay in the palace while the information chain investigation is conducted." He said, "Not in the dungeon." He said it with the specific quality of a man who understood that the sentence required clarification. She wrote, "I understand." She added, "The decision about the settlements." He said, "It will not be ratified until the full information chain has been reviewed." He said, "And the settlement's water dependency will be in the summary when it is." She looked at him. She wrote, "Thank you." He said, "I am not doing you a favor." He said, "I am doing what a king is supposed to do when he realizes he does not have all the information." The information chain had 7 people in it. She learned this over the following 5 days, during which she remained in the palace's guest quarters, not confined, not under formal restriction, simply present while the investigation that Raven was conducting made its way through the administrative structure. She had no voice for the first 4 days and limited voice on the 5th, a whisper. The specific first return of something she had thought might not come back. She spent the time writing. Not the investigation's documents, those were Raven's domain, and she had provided everything she could provide at the first session. She wrote her own account of the gift, the most complete account she had ever attempted, in the specific patient way of someone who had been carrying something for 20 years and was for the first time in a context where the documentation might be received rather than used against her. Raven came to see her each evening. She had not anticipated this. The first evening she had assumed it was a follow-up inquiry. It was a follow-up inquiry. The second evening there was a question about one of the technical documents that required her annotation. The third evening he arrived with no specific question, but with the specific quality of a person who had formed a habit and was following it. She wrote, "There is no administrative reason for you to be here tonight." He said, "No." He said, "I am aware." He said, "The investigation is producing information that is uncomfortable to sit with alone." She wrote, "What kind of uncomfortable?" He said, "The kind that involves understanding that the administrative structure between me and the kingdom's reality is considerably thicker than I believed it was." She wrote, "The command frequency makes people tell you what they think you want to hear." He looked at her. He said, "Explain that." She wrote for several minutes. She explained the specific mechanism. That command frequency compulsion produced compliance. And compliance included the compulsion to be compliant in the information provided. That a king running passive background command frequency in his council sessions was, without intending to, producing an environment in which the information his council provided him was filtered through the council's assessment of what he wanted. That the command frequency was a tool for managing people that had the specific side effect of making those people manage what they told him. He read it. He said, "And around you." She wrote, "Around me the passive command frequency is unreliable. Which means in your vicinity, the people around you will respond to you rather than to the command frequency. Which means you will hear what they actually think rather than what the frequency compels them to express." He said, "That is why you disrupted the session." She wrote, "I did not intend to disrupt it. I intended to speak. The disruption was a side effect of my voice at that level." He said, "But the disruption produced the specific condition where your voice could be heard rather than overridden." She wrote, "Yes." He said, "Which means the disruption was not the problem. The disruption was the solution." She wrote, "Yes." He looked at that word for a long time. He said, "I put the solution in the dungeon." She wrote, "Yes." On the sixth day her whisper became a voice. Not the full gift, the controlled everyday level. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI. And the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. The listening frequency, present and soft. She could speak without triggering the intermediate register if she was careful about the emotional temperature of what she was saying. She was careful. She had been careful for 20 years, and she was practiced. He came at the usual evening hour and found her speaking for the first time. And his expression at the moment of hearing her voice, even at its most controlled level, was the expression of someone who had been reading about something and had just received the experience of it. He sat down. She said, carefully, in the most modulated version of her voice she could produce, "Your command frequency." He said, "Yes." She said, "It is not active right now." He said, "No." He said, "I have been running it at reduced levels since the dungeon report." He said it with the specific quality of someone admitting to a deliberate decision. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the report described 17 people standing around you without trying to flee, and I wanted to understand what made them stand rather than run." He said, "I thought it was related to your gift's ambient quality, the listening frequency you described." He said, "I wanted to see if I could perceive it." She said, "Can you?" He said, "Yes." He said it simply. He said, "It is the quality that made me pay attention to you in court when I should have used the command frequency to restore order instead." She said, "Should have." He said, "I have been rethinking that word for 6 days." He said, "The command frequency is a tool I use to manage my court. I use it automatically, the way you described the listening frequency passively, as a background state rather than a deliberate choice." He said, "I have been considering whether there are situations where managing my court is the specific problem rather than the solution." She said, "The council session was one of them." He said, "Yes." She said, The command frequency was producing compliance from people who had information that their compliance prevented them from providing accurately. He said, yes. She said, and my presence disrupted the compliance. He said, and you provided the information. She said, and you imprisoned me for it. He said, yes. He looked at her. He said, I want to understand the intermediate register. He said, not as a security assessment. He said it with the specific quality of a man who was distinguishing between two different motivations and was being precise about which one he was acting from. She explained it. She told him what it felt like from inside the specific involuntary activation. The physical sensation of the disruption frequency, the cost. She told him what it felt like when the command frequency tried to compel her and found no purchase, the strange, specific experience of standing in the act of compulsion and simply being unmoved by it. Not through resistance, but through the fundamental incompatibility of the gift's frequency with the command frequency's mechanism. He listened with the quality of someone constructing a precise internal model of what they were hearing. He said, you have been experiencing the command frequency as compulsion your entire life. She said, every alpha authority figure I have encountered uses it. He said, and it has never worked on you. She said, no. He said, and you have been managing the disruption frequency to avoid producing that specific information. She said, yes. He said, because producing it has consequences. She said, yes. He said, the dungeon was the most recent consequence. She said, yes. She paused. She said, it was also the most recent demonstration. He looked at her. She said, the dungeon's locks were the most literal possible version of what happens when you attempt to contain this gift. She said, I am not saying this as a threat. I am saying it as accurate information. He said, I understand the distinction. He said it with the quality that she was learning to recognize as his genuine register, the version of him that was not managing but receiving. He said, I believe you. He came early on the 7th evening. She understood from the quality of the evening light that it was earlier than usual, and from his expression when he arrived that the investigation had produced something that day that he had been sitting with before he came. She said, tell me. He said, the information chain. He said, the 7 people. He said, the omission of the settlement data was not a single person's decision. It was a practiced pattern, the specific accumulated editing of information before it reached the summary level, developed over approximately 4 years of council sessions by a group of 4 administrators who had learned, through experience with the command frequency environment, which information produced decisions they preferred and which information produced decisions they did not prefer. He said, they had not been directing me. He said it with the specific weight of someone who had been considering this carefully. He said, they had been informing me. He said, the specific information they chose to provide and to omit had been shaping my decisions for 4 years without my awareness. She said, yes. He said, and the mechanism that made this possible was the command frequency. She said, yes. He said, because in a command frequency environment, people develop the specific skill of managing what the authority hears in order to produce outcomes the authority will then believe they chose. She said, it is not unique to your court. It is how command frequency governance consistently functions over time. She said, it produces the specific information environment where the king has more certainty and less accuracy than any single honest advisor could provide. He said, "And you disrupted that environment." She said, "My voice disrupted it. The disruption was involuntary." He said, "But the information you provided was accurate." She said, "Yes." He said, "And if I had received it through the petition process as filed, without the court session, without the disruption?" She said, "You would have received it in a summary prepared by the same four administrators, which would not have contained the settlement's water dependency." He was quiet. She said, "The petition process is managed by the same administrative layer that manages the council summaries." He said, "I know." He said, "I have known since this morning." He said it in the specific voice of a man who had been sitting with this since morning and was not finished sitting with it. She said, "I am not telling you this to extend the accounting." He said, "I know." He said, "You are telling me because it is accurate, and you cannot tell me inaccurate things." She said, "Yes." He said, after a long moment, "I have been governing a kingdom for 6 years." He said, "I have been competent and informed and present." He said, "I have been making decisions on the basis of the information available to me." He said, "The information available to me was shaped by 4 people whose primary skill was understanding which information I found comfortable." He said, "I imprisoned the first person in 6 years whose voice bypassed that shaping." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry." He said it with the specific quality of something that had been building since the Dungeon Master's report, not the managed apology of a king offering diplomatic resolution, but the specific, inadequate, genuine attempt of a man who understood what he had done and was not finding the understanding comfortable. She received it. She did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right, and she was not capable of telling him things that were not true. She said, "I receive it as what it is." He said, "Which is?" She said, "The beginning of something." She said, "Not the end." By the 10th day, she had her voice fully back at the everyday level. Not the intermediate register that required a specific emotional pressure she was not under, which meant it was available but dormant. The deep register she did not think about consciously, the way she did not think about the way her body handled extreme cold. It was a response to conditions she was not experiencing and hoped not to experience again. She could speak. She chose, in those days, to speak less than she was capable of and listen more, which was not its usual meaning. She was not being cautious. She was simply discovering that in this specific context, in these specific conversations, listening was producing information she found genuinely interesting, and she did not want to interrupt it with more of her own voice than necessary. He talked about the kingdom, not the political structure. The kingdom, the settlements she had come to represent, but also the other settlements, the border communities, the inner territories, populations whose experience of governance was whatever filtered down through the administrative structure that she had just demonstrated was not neutral. He talked about decisions he had made and what he had believed he was deciding and what, in the light of the information chain investigation, the decisions actually looked like. She listened. Occasionally she asked questions, short ones, the specific questions of someone who understood the material well enough to ask about the edges rather than the center. On the 12th day she said, "You are rereading 6 years of decisions." He said, "Yes." She said, "How many of them look different?" He said, "Enough to be significant." She said, "What are you going to do about the ones that look different?" He said, "I am going to start with the ones that are still active." He said, "The settlement's decision will be revised with the full data." There are 4 other decisions in the current active queue that I am reviewing with the complete underlying documentation rather than the summary. She said, that is the immediate response. He said, yes. He said, the structural response is what I have not determined. She said, the 4 administrators. He said, removed from summary preparation. He said, I am not certain removal is sufficient to address what they represent, which is a systemic tendency rather than 4 individuals' decisions. She said, the systemic tendency is the command frequency environment. He said, yes. She said, which produces, over time, information management by the people most skilled at reading what the command frequency environment rewards. He said, yes. She said, the structural response would address the environment. He said, yes. He looked at her. He said, I have thoughts about what the structural response could look like. He said, I am not going to propose them until I understand what you think the problem requires. Because you understand the problem in a way I am still learning to understand. She looked at him with the listening frequency operating at its passive level and received what was. They're the genuine quality of a man who was prioritizing accuracy over the discomfort of not being the person with the answer. She said, I need to think about it. He said, of course. She said, the gift cannot be the structural response by itself. She said, it cannot be my personal presence that makes the information environment accurate. She said, that produces a dependency that is fragile in the way that all personal dependencies are fragile. He said, I know. He said, I was thinking about that too. She said, you were thinking about the same problem from a different angle. He said, yes. She said, tell me your angle. He told her. She told him hers. They worked on it together for the rest of the evening and into the night. In the specific quality of collaboration between 2 people whose tools were genuinely different and genuinely complementary. And neither of them noticed when the fire in the grate burned down and the room became very quiet around them. The council faction filed its formal challenge on the 14th day. It was submitted through the palace's administrative council, not the investigation's jurisdiction. The parallel governance track that the faction had apparently been preparing since the Dungeon Master's report first circulated. The challenge argued 3 positions. That the dungeon's structural damage constituted a demonstrated security threat that could not be addressed through administrative reform. That the investigation's conduct represented a compromise of the palace's governance integrity through excessive involvement of an outside party with a demonstrated hostile relationship with the palace's authority. And that the welfare of the kingdom required the immediate removal of the individual responsible for the dungeon's damage from palace proximity. The challenge's language was careful. It did not argue that her gift was not real after the dungeon, arguing that would have looked like denial rather than policy. It argued that the gift's real existence was precisely the reason for her removal. That a gift capable of the dungeon's destruction was a security liability that the palace could not responsibly manage. She read it. She said to Raven, the second argument is the most significant one. He said, the compromise of governance integrity argument. She said, yes. She said, it frames the investigation itself as the problem arguing that my involvement in reviewing the information chain is inherently compromised because I have an interest in the investigation's findings. He said, which is accurate. She said, I do have an interest. She said, I also have the most precise technical knowledge of what the information chain documents mean. Because I am the person who gathered the underlying data. She said, the question is whether interest disqualifies knowledge. He said, it typically does not in this kingdom's legal framework. She said, the faction knows this. She said, which means the second argument is not a legal argument. It is a framing argument. She said, it is designed to make the investigation look politically motivated in a way that shifts attention from what the investigation found to who found it. He said, and if it succeeds. She said, it buries the information chain findings under a dispute about me. She said, the settlement situation becomes secondary to the question of whether I should be here. He said, which is what they want. She said, yes. He said, what do you want to do? She looked at him. This was the question she had been sitting with since she read the challenge, what she wanted to do, as distinct from what the situation required. She said, I want to address the political crisis in a way that does not make me the center of it. He said, how? She said, the witnesses. He said, the investigation witnesses. She said, yes. She said, the 4 administrators are not the only people who can speak to the information chain's operation. Every council member who participated in a summary session over the past 4 years received the filtered information. She said, under the command frequency environment, they were not lying, they were complying. She said, outside the command frequency environment, at least some of them know that what they provided was shaped. He said, and if the command frequency environment is not active in a formal council session. She said, and if there is nothing in the room managing what they feel comfortable saying. He said, then we will hear what they actually know. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the faction has given a 48-hour response window. She said, I know. She said, I need to be in the council session when it happens. He said, your voice at the intermediate register. She said, yes. She said, the first intentional use. She said, I know what the cost is and I am prepared to pay it. He looked at her. He said, you have been preparing for this since the challenge arrived. She said, I have been preparing for this since I was 6 years old. The council session was called for the following morning. She spent the evening in the specific preparation that the gift's intentional use required not the management discipline of keeping it contained, but the specific reversal of that discipline, the careful, deliberate calibration of opening. She had never done this before. Every previous activation of the intermediate register had been involuntary. The pressure had built until the gift activated rather than her choosing the activation. The intentional version required a different relationship with the gift than 20 years of containment had produced. She sat in her quarters and worked on it the way she worked on everything that required precision. Methodically, without rushing, giving each step the attention it needed. She found in the process that the gift was more willing to be opened than she had expected. She thought about this. She thought about 20 years of management, the daily calibration, the careful modulation, the practiced softness of a voice that had always been capable of something larger. She thought about what the management had cost not only her, but the gift itself, the specific, accumulated pressure of something being held below its natural level for decades. She thought, it wants to be used. Not the deep register. That level did not want anything consciously. It was the body's most fundamental response to threat, and she was not in threat. The intermediate register. The level that disrupted command frequency and produced the conditions where truth could be heard. That level had been pressing against the management for 20 years, and she had held it. And in the dungeon, the deep level had responded to the physical crisis, and the intermediate level had finally, in the aftermath, found a context where it was not being held. She said very quietly in her empty room, "I am going to use you tomorrow." The gift's response was the specific internal resonance of something settling into readiness. She slept. In the morning, she walked into the council chamber. The faction's senior members were present. Their witnesses assembled 3 outer territory administrators who had prepared testimony arguing that the dungeon's damage was not isolated, but consistent with a pattern of disruption in the settlements Sable had previously inhabited. The testimony was designed to build the case for permanent removal. The command frequency in the room was running at full passive level. She felt at the moment she entered the ambient compulsion saturating the air, the specific pressure of it on everyone present. The witnesses sat in the precise quality of people who had been briefed and who were prepared to say what they had been prepared to say. She sat. She breathed. She opened the intermediate register not all at once, carefully, the calibrated version she had been practicing. The command frequency in the room made a sound she heard in her bones. The specific dissonance of 2 incompatible frequencies occupying the same space. The witnesses shifted. Their expressions changed not dramatically. The specific small softening of people who have been under sustained pressure and have just had the pressure reduced. The first witness said, in a voice that had a different quality than the prepared testimony quality, "I should say that what I was told to describe as a pattern of disruption was in some cases the resolution of disputes that had been unresolvable for years." He said it with the specific quality of someone who had been going to say something else and had found, with the command frequency unavailable, that the prepared version no longer felt possible. The second witness looked at the faction's senior member and then at the table and said, "The settlements where she was present had consistently better administrative outcomes than comparable settlements." He said, "I do not know how to reconcile that with the characterization I was asked to provide." The third witness said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I came here to provide testimony about a security threat." She paused. She said, "I think the security threat is not what I was told it was." The council chamber was quiet. Raven looked at the faction's senior member. The faction's senior member looked at witnesses who were no longer providing the testimony they had been prepared for. The faction's administrative lead said, "The council should note that the command frequency disruption currently in effect is itself evidence of." Raven said, "The council session will proceed." He said it with the quiet authority that was not command frequency, but was something older and more fundamental. He said, "Everyone in this room will say what they actually know." She had been holding the intermediate register for 40 minutes. The cost was building the specific headache that indicated the gift was at sustained operational depth, the rawness beginning in her throat. She had anticipated this. She had planned for it. She was not going to stop until the session produced what it needed to produce. The council chamber had the specific quality of a room that had been freed from something not dramatically, not with visible transformation, but in the subtle way that a space changed when the ambient pressure that had been shaping behavior was reduced. People were sitting differently. The witnesses who had already spoken had the specific relief of people who had said something true after preparing to say something managed. There were 2 more witnesses. The fourth witness was a palace administrator who had been in the summary preparation process for 3 years. She had prepared testimony about the information chain that supported the faction's position that the omission of settlement data was an oversight rather than a pattern, that the investigation's framing was politically motivated. She sat down. She looked at the table. She said, "I cannot say what I prepared to say." She said, "I prepared to say it was an oversight." She said, "I know it was not." She said, "The settlement data was removed specifically because it would have complicated the decision the council wanted the king to ratify." The fifth witness was the faction's own chief archivist, brought to provide documentation supporting the historical precedent for command frequency governance. He opened his documents. He looked at them. He said, "These documents support the position I was asked to support." He said, "They are accurate documents." He said, "I should also tell you that they are incomplete, and that the complete documentation supports a different position." The faction's senior member said, "This session has been contaminated by the disruption of the command frequency, and any testimony provided under these conditions is." Raven said, "The session is not contaminated." He said it with absolute clarity. He said, "The session is accurate." He said, "What has been contaminated for 4 years is the information I was receiving." He said, "This session is the first uncontaminated information environment I have had in this council chamber in 4 years." He said, "The testimony will be entered into the formal record." The faction's senior member was silent. Sable released the intermediate register. The headache arrived immediately, the cost's full weight, the rawness in her throat, the specific exhaustion of a sustained intentional activation. She sat with it without expression. She had paid this cost many times, and she would pay it again, and she had known before she began that she would be paying it now. She wrote on the paper in front of her, "The session has produced what it needed to. I am going to need to rest." Raven looked at her across the table. He said, "Yes." He said it with the specific quality of someone who had been watching the cost build and had been waiting for her to acknowledge it before addressing it. He said, "To the chamber, the formal record is complete." He said, "The session is closed." The formal record from the council session was 7 pages. It contained the complete testimony of 5 witnesses, all of whom had provided accounts that diverged significantly from their prepared positions. It contained the administrative archivist's account of the information chain's operation, not an oversight, a pattern for years of consistent directional filtering. It contained the chief archivist's documentation, expanded by his own amendment to include the historical precedent he had said was incomplete, which showed that command frequency governance had a documented historical pattern of producing exactly the information environment the investigation had identified. And it contained the witness who had not spoken, the faction's senior member, who had sat through the session in the specific silence of a man who had watched his position collapse from the inside out and was deciding whether to attempt a recovery. He made a statement the following morning. He did not recant the challenge. He amended it. He said that the challenge's security concerns remained valid, but that the proposed response removal was not the appropriate structural solution. He said that the investigation's findings were significant and required administrative reform. He said that the information filtering had been conducted by members of his own administrative staff without his knowledge. She read this and thought, he is probably not lying about the last part. Raven read it and said, he is not lying about the last part. She said, it doesn't matter whether he knew specifically. She said, the environment that made it possible was the environment he was invested in maintaining. He said, yes. He said, But a man who discovers that the environment he maintained produced outcomes he did not authorize is a different political problem than a man who authorized the outcomes. He said, he can be addressed through the reform. The man who authorized the outcomes would need to be addressed differently. She said, you have been thinking about the political architecture. He said, it is what I am trained for. She said, and I have been thinking about the structural architecture. He said, it is what you are trained for. He said it with the specific quality of someone who had arrived at a genuine assessment rather than a diplomatic one. She said, so we have the same problem from different angles again. He said, yes. He said, I am starting to think this is a pattern. She said, it is a pattern. She said, it is probably a useful one. He looked at her. She said, complementary rather than redundant. She said, we keep arriving at the same problem from different directions, and the combination of the two directions is more complete than either direction alone. He said, yes. She said, that is what the structural response needs to look like. She said, not a single voice that bypasses the filtering. Not a single authority that manages the environment. She said, a structure that combines the two approaches so that neither is dependent on the other's presence. He said, the Sovereign Voice Council. She said, yes. He called the full court session on the 17th day. She attended. She sat at the session table rather than the gallery, not at the head, not at the council's formal position. At a working seat with the specific authority of someone who had been contributing to the outcome being announced. She had not asked for this position. He had indicated it without asking whether she wanted it, and she had sat down. He stood at the session center. He said, 17 days ago I signed an order to imprison a woman who spoke in my court. He said, I signed it because her voice disrupted the command frequency I was using to manage the session. He said, I signed it because the disruption felt like a challenge to my authority, and I responded to the feeling before I asked what the disruption was telling me. He said, the disruption was telling me that the information I was about to ratify was incomplete. He said, it was telling me that 4,000 people who would have been directly harmed by my decision were not present in the information I had been given. He said, it was telling me that my court's information environment had been managed by people skilled at managing it, and that what they were managing was me. He said, I imprison the only person in this court whose presence made that management unavailable. He said, the investigation has produced a complete account of the information chain and its 4-year pattern of directional filtering. He said, the administrative personnel involved have been removed from summary preparation and are under formal review. He said, the Council's summary process is being restructured with full underlying documentation required at the decision level. He said, none of this corrects what was done to Sable. He said her name with the specific weight of someone who had been saying it internally for 17 days and was saying it externally for the first time in a formal context. He said, the dungeon was wrong. The imprisonment was wrong. What she said in court was accurate, and I responded to the accuracy with a cage. He said, the cage could not hold her. He said it with the specific quality of a man who understood that the sentence had more than one meaning. He said, that is a thing the kingdom should understand about what I tried to cage. The full court was quiet. The faction's senior member was present. He did not speak. Sable sat at the working table and received the accounting with the specific composure of someone who had needed this and was not performing gratitude for it. She received its weight and its honesty and the specific cost she could see in his bearing the cost of saying true things in public about being wrong. She wrote nothing. She did not need to. She said, the evening after the full court session, "I have requirements." He said, "I know." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The Sovereign Voice Council." She described it, an independent body, constitutionally established rather than administratively created, with the specific authority to provide unfiltered information to the King's Court through practitioners trained in the specific skill of operating outside command frequency environments. Not a single person a council, staffed and structured so that it did not depend on any individual's presence. Its authority to present information at the council level without administrative summary filtering. Its protection from removal or interference by the administrative layer it was designed to bypass. He said, "Yes to all of it." He said, "I want to add one provision." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The council's membership should not be limited to Omega practitioners with voice gifts." He said, "The gift produces the clearest version of what the council needs to do. But the council's function is the provision of unfiltered information. And that function can be trained in people without the gift who understand the command frequency's filtering effect and are committed to addressing it." She looked at him. He said, "I want it to outlast you." He said, "The way the founding queen built the vault to outlast her." She said, "You have been reading about the founding queen." He said, "Lisa's case reached the historical record last month." He said, "I found it instructive." She said, "Yes." She said, "Your provision is correct." She said, "The council should outlast both of us." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And personally?" She looked at him. She said, "The accounting in the full court session." He said, "Yes." She said, "It was the most honest thing I have heard a person in authority say in a public context." She said, "I am telling you this as accurate information, not as softening." He said, "I know the difference." She said, "I know you do." She paused. She said, "I am staying." She said it with the specific clarity of a decision made rather than being made. She said, "The council is why I am staying institutionally." She said, "The other reason I am staying is a separate matter." He said, "The other reason?" She said, "Yes." She said, "The evidence base for the other reason is not complete yet." She said, "I will tell you when it is." He said, "How will I know when to ask?" She said, "I will tell you that too." He said, "That is acceptable." She said, "I know." The Sovereign Voice Council was established 6 weeks after the full court session. Its founding charter was the most precise governance document she had ever written, and she had written it in collaboration with the only person whose governance knowledge was comparable to her gift knowledge, which meant the document was both constitutionally sound and administratively practical in a way that neither of them could have produced alone. The council's first 7 members included 2 practitioners with voice gifts not at the level of her own gift. The specific voice frequency that disrupted command signals was rare, but with the lower register version that produced enhanced listening and unfiltered communication in the people around them. The remaining 5 members were trained in the specific methodology she and Raven had developed over the 17 days of written and spoken exchange. The methodology of providing information without filtering it through assessment of what the recipient wanted to hear. The Council's first formal session addressed 5 outstanding decisions in the active queue that Raven had placed on hold pending review with full underlying documentation. 3 of the 5 required significant revision when reviewed against the complete data. 1 required complete reversal. The 5th was upheld. The underlying data supported the summary. The 4th decision's reversal, the water rights allocation. The complete revision now included the settlement's water dependency. The settlements received the specific provision they needed, and the Eastern Noble Territories received an alternative water access arrangement that the revised process identified in the full documentation. 4,000 people kept their water. She did not make a particular note of this to Raven. She did not need to. He knew why she had come to the palace. He knew what the revision meant. He came to her quarters on the evening the reversal was formally ratified and said, "It is done." She said, "Yes." He said, "You came to the palace for 4,000 people, and you got them." She said, "I came to the palace for 4,000 people, and I got imprisoned, and then I got them." She said, "The timeline was nonlinear." He said, "The dungeons locked doors." She said, "Yes." He said, "The evidence base." She looked at him. She said, "Is complete." He said, "I was going to ask tonight regardless." She said, "I know." She said, "I decided last week." He said, "Why last week?" She said, "You read the documents from the Eastern Settlement yourself instead of receiving a summary." She said, "You asked the settlement administrator the questions directly instead of through the council's administrative layer." She said, "You came back and told me what you found instead of having someone tell me." He said, "Those are small things." She said, "They are not small." She said, "They are exactly the size of what I needed to see." He said, "Then?" She said, "Then." The fire in the grate burned. The palace was quiet around them with the specific quality of a late evening that had been building towards something and had arrived. 3 years forward. The Sovereign Voice Council had processed 214 information reviews in 3 years. Of those, 67 had required significant revision when reviewed against complete underlying data. 11 had required complete reversal. The rest had been upheld. The majority of the existing governance decisions, it turned out, had been sound. The filtering had been directional rather than comprehensive. The administrators had not been distorting everything. Only the decisions where distortion served their preferences. The 11 reversals had addressed 11 situations that had been producing harm quietly and continuously below the threshold of what the command frequency environment had made it possible to see. The Sovereign Voice Council's methodology had been adapted by 3 other kingdoms in the region, none of which had practitioners with voice gifts. The methodology did not require the gift. It required the specific training and institutional commitment to providing information without filtering it, which turned out to be teachable in the absence of the biological gift, though the biological gift produced the clearest version of the environment it enabled. The dungeon was preserved. She had proposed this and Raven had agreed immediately, which told her what she needed to know about his understanding of what it represented. The broken locks were in place, not repaired, preserved. The cell doors stood open. A small explanatory text was posted in the corridor, written by the council's archivist, describing what had happened and what it had led to. People came to see it, more than she had expected. They stood in the corridor with the broken iron and the open doors, and they had the specific expression of people receiving information that they already knew at a level beneath conscious knowledge, and were now being given words for. Raven came to find her in the council's working room on a morning in the 3rd year. She was reviewing a forthcoming decision's underlying data with 2 of the council's junior members, not the summary, the original documentation. The specific methodology that had become the council's standard practice. He said, "The Eastern Territories have submitted a water rights proposal for the secondary channel." She said, "I know." She said, "It is in the next queue." He said, "They have asked that it be reviewed with the complete underlying data." She said, "They always ask now." He said, "Yes." He said it with the specific quality of a statement that meant something larger than itself. She looked at him. She said, "All 3." He said, "All 3 settlements." She said, "Yes." He said, "The secondary channel." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you are confident?" She said, "The underlying data is clear." She said, "It has been clear since the first reversal." She said, "The secondary channel works for both parties without harm to either." He said, "Then we ratify it today." She said, "Today." He sat down across from her at the working table, where the data was spread between them, and looked at it with the full quality of his attention, not the managed summary, the actual numbers. The junior members watched this without comment, because this was what work at the Sovereign Voice Council looked like, and this was what the king looked like when he was in the council's working room, and neither of those things was unusual anymore. She pressed her hand briefly to the table, not a gesture, simply the specific physical contact of someone who was present in a place that was hers in a way that no place had ever been hers before. Not because it had been given, because she had built it. The gift ran at its ambient level, the listening frequency, always present, the one she could never turn off. Everyone in the room was a little more present, a little more honest with themselves, a little more aware of the actual nature of what they were doing. She had spent 20 years keeping it small. She had stopped. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.